has a production team. He's a more sophisticated vlogger than me. I'm more like a do-it-yourself.
No, I'm probably more of a technical idiot.
No, I'm just saying all of us are learning here, so it's great to
Yeah.
talk to you, James.
No, but Yeri's been great. He does all the artwork on
Thank you so much. Very
my
kind of
column
you.
and whatever.
Happy New Year again. Okay,
Absolutely. And to you.
Recording stopped.
I'll
The
do it
recording
again
has stopped.
once we are ready to go. Okay, James, so just to give you a general idea, so around 40-45 minutes perhaps maximum, although
Sure.
you know me, I'm very talkative. We can go for
Right.
4 hours, but
We both
I
are.
just traveled. I don't want to make you too tired.
Right. No, I'm don't worry about it.
But this is perfect time. I thought to reach out to you, knowing your background. I mean, as a person, but also, of course, your specialty. I think as far as Asia goes, you are the top authority when it comes to looking at the nexus between football and politics.
Well, thank you.
But I also wanted to get your point of view on, I mean, of course, we have that similar Middle Eastern background, but my audience is
Sure.
primarily younger generations in Southeast
Right.
Asia. So we're hoping also to discuss about where do you see the future of football in the region is going. Of course, in Indonesia, we have a crazy situation. In the Philippines, our women's football is not doing too bad. But generally in ASEAN, how are we going? What are your suggestions? You're in Thailand, which I not until recently had a pretty decent team, right? I was
Right.
checking among ASEAN countries.
Keep one thing in mind. I'm not a sports fan, or at least
Yeah.
not a football fan. So I don't follow the game as a sport.
Yeah. Sure.
So when it comes to, you know, players, coaches,
Right.
tactics, who's really up, who's really down. To a degree,
Right.
I know that in the Middle East, obviously, but I don't follow it as such. So we'll
You
see
mean
how
in
that
the
goes.
ASEAN region? You mean the ASEAN region?
Right. I mean, I follow
Yeah,
it in
me
terms
too.
of.
I mean, I'm not gonna pretend. You know, I also know Middle East and Europe. Honestly, I don't know much. Even Boca Juniors and all. I barely follow South America.
Sure.
So I think we're in the same boat. For me, it's more like, what are the lessons from the Middle East, from Europe? You know, especially in Morocco. I want to talk about Morocco a lot because it's a country with a per capita almost exactly the same as Indonesia and the Philippines, right?
Sure.
Uh,
No. It's a much smaller country.
Much more. No, I mean per capita income. I mean per capita.
Oh yeah. Right.
In terms
Right.
of level of
Okay.
development, right? Like $3,700 per capita. So it's definitely not a wealthy country by any measure, but we can see that the investments, you know, the the fifth or fourth complex, you know, the investment in women, those are fantastic things. No, and then maybe
Right.
James, I mean, I want to take advantage of this opportunity, but I think we can have a separate, hopefully, podcast down the road. I want to also of course talk about your other expertise, which is Islam and Middle East and the impact here in Asia. I mean,
Right.
I mean, of course, I'm on your newsletters. I read a lot of your fantastic stuff, and we have almost 99% agreement. I mean, there's a time I raise my eyebrows, and you discuss about this competing Islams. You know, the Indonesia version, the Emirati version, the
Right.
Saudi version. Just
Right.
put aside the Iran one for a while because they're Shia.
Sure.
It doesn't appeal as much. So
Right.
maybe we can talk about that also later on.
Happy to.
Yeah. Yes. So I'll take advantage of you. So we essentially
Sure.
transition between two of your major specializations.
Sure. Go ahead and abuse.
Yeah. Might as and my point is, we wanted to do this for a long time. I just felt the World Cup was a perfect time to bring you in
Right.
terms of the football. But
Sure.
obviously, when it comes to the issue of Islamism, politics, this is relevant also to us in the Philippines because of the Mindanao situation. So I would be really
Sure.
happy to take your views, and then later on,
Sure.
hopefully down the road, we can have more specialized discussions.
1 second, Richard. 1 second. Do you mind? Tess wants to. You know Tess,
How are
right?
you? Of course.
Yeah. Tess wants to listen in. Do you mind if I send her the link?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, by
Yeah.
the way, just to give you some idea, James. So what I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna go live on my Facebook, which it doesn't show us fully, but they can just listen into us because I want people to
Sure.
ask questions. No. So
Sure.
this
Before you
is
do
my
that, let me
live.
just give Tess one shout. Tess, I just sent it to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry
So,
about that.
what I want, James, is because I want some folks to raise questions. So this questions.
Sure.
will be
No,
part of our
happy to.
discussion.
That's
But I'll
great.
release this separately later on. So it's kind of double live, if I can put it that way, right?
Sure.
because
That sounds good to me.
we have some very interesting audience who ask very good questions. So it
Sure.
would be a waste if I don't get live.
No, it'd be a pleasure.
Fantastic. I mean, of course, I know, James, you're like me, right? Unfortunately, too brave and talkative at the same time, but maybe fortunately, right? Because there's some people that are not comfortable with that, and they rather have the finalized edited version, whatever.
No,
But,
no, I'm
yeah.
you know, that always is a lack of confidence.
Exactly. So I'm glad that we're on the same page on this. So I'll go live shortly and then turn on
Sure.
also my own live feed here. So for people to pitch in. All right. Okay. Let's go.
Recording in progress.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right, folks. So welcome to our latest podcast edition. Happy New Year. It's a New Year 2023. But just weeks before the New Year, we had one of the biggest events on earth, right? And that was the World Cup. World Cup 2022. Usually the World Cup is, of course, held earlier in the year, but because of the special circumstances of Qatar and the Middle East, it was held closer to Christmas, which made it, I think, for me at least, double special. I don't know about the players. So in light of that, I thought it's a perfect time to get back to a very good friend of mine, Dr. James Dorsey, who's, I think you're still based in both National University of Singapore and also in RSIS. So you're affiliated with both universities in Singapore, but of course, one is with the Middle East Institute, another one is for your other kind of work, right?
Well, I've left the Middle East Institute, but I've kept my association with RSIS.
RSIS. So I primarily you're with the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, I suppose.
That's correct.
But for a long time, of course, you were with the Middle East Institute in the National University of Singapore. And that's one of the reasons, of course, a lot of us had the privilege of getting to know you and your works. I mean, I'm one of those people who read your works first before meeting you. And I think that happens also a lot to me, right? With a lot of people, they know my works and then they meet me.
Sure.
I'm really glad that, James, we caught up. I was always looking for an excuse for us to catch up. I always look forward to our conversation. The last time I think we were together was during a book talk I gave on Duterte a few years back. So here we are finally having a chance to talk together to each other. Now, I want to abuse you really, James, but I really look forward to even more detailed discussion. Of course, you as a public thinker, a journalist, you cover a lot. So I on two issues I want to really focus on today. The first one is something that I think is much more light-hearted, but still very serious and exciting, and that's football. That's soccer. Both of us had a lot of time in other parts of the world, including the Middle East, and I know you have a background in North Africa, and that's why I want to discuss also Morocco with you, James, sure. And the experience of Morocco and what can it tell us about the future of football. So can you just give us a brief background, James, about yourself? I mean, how did you become the guy on this whole football and politics and very interesting genre of analysis? Now, before we go into your Middle East and Islamism and all of those other issues.
Sure. It really was a fluke. And a fluke combined with a lot of luck.
Right.
So in the summer of 2010, on the eve of the World Cup in South Africa.
South Africa, yeah.
I wrote a piece that discussed why the political reasons that were holding Middle Eastern and North African clubs or teams back in terms of performing, particularly in the World Cup. And a friend of mine read the piece. He's a very successful author. He's also a football player and a football fan. And he phoned me up and said, "You have a book." And it's sort of, you need someone to say something to you for the penny to drop. And he said that at a moment at which I was looking for a way of writing a book, which was not going to be another memoir and was not going to be another analyst's crossing the T's and dotting the I's to be different. And I was also looking for something that would attract not just the usual suspects. And football just was the perfect prism. And I didn't realize at that time, but I realized it over time as I delved into all of this, just how crucial football was throughout the modern development of the Middle East, if you wish.
Yeah.
And then I was lucky. So this was 2010. In December 2010, you
Arab
had the
Spring.
kickoff in Tunisia
Yeah.
of the popular Arab revolts,
Yeah.
where football fans played a key role, particularly in Egypt.
Right.
And it was a story that at least I was one of those who broke the story.
Yep. Yep.
And the rest is history,
Of course. Yeah,
basically.
James, can I rewind a little bit? So, can you give us a little bit of idea about your background? So you were raised in the Middle East, in North Africa in particular, and
No, I was raised across the globe, basically.
but you
Latin
spent a
America.
lot of time in North Africa, right? You have background in Morocco?
Right. Well, I'm of Moroccan descent. And yeah, that's how I identify also.
Right.
But basically I was a foreign correspondent for more than 40 years.
Yeah. Right.
And I was based across the Middle East, but the focus of my career was ethnic and religious conflict. The Middle East is clearly a center point of that.
Yeah, the cauldron. Yeah, the cauldron.
Yeah, cauldron of that.
Yeah, exactly.
And so as a result, I was based in 10 over the years in 10 different Middle Eastern countries.
Wow.
In the Gulf, in the Levant, in Egypt,
Maghreb,
in Southeastern Europe, Turkey, Cyprus, Greece.
Right.
And so as a result, obviously, I built up a bit of history there.
And how did football come into the picture?
Well, as I mentioned, it came by sheer coincidence. I wrote this piece, and it was really a piece that was a fluke.
Yeah,
it was
but how can you write a decent, more than decent piece if you're not familiar enough with football, right? Were you like following the big rival?
No, not at all. On the contrary, I was totally uninterested in it. But the argument that I was making in that piece in 2010 was that the political stalemate in the Middle East, the grip of autocracies on on society, the total political control that you see across the Middle East, with perhaps the exception of Turkey and Israel, of football particularly, and football's is important because keep in mind football is the most popular form of popular entertainment.
Right.
It's an aggressive sport. It's about conquering the other half of the pitch.
Right.
Loyalties are tribal. And so as a result, football and stadiums are an almost natural platform for protest. And in the Middle East, the passion for football rivals the passion with which religion is experienced.
Yeah.
And so what it meant was that the autocrat couldn't just simply shut it down. You had other cultural forms of protest in music.
Yeah.
It was fairly easy. You didn't let a musician in, you put him behind bars, story ended. You couldn't just, until 2011, with the protests, you couldn't shut down a stadium.
Yep.
And there was another aspect to this. The football and the stadium were both a threat to the ruler, but they were also an opportunity.
Yeah.
So if you go back to 2009, when Egypt and Algeria played, and this was about qualification for the 2010 South Africa World Cup. The Algerians beat the Egyptians. What happened there was that the Mubaraks, Hosni Mubarak, the then president of Egypt, and his sons had totally identified themselves with Egyptian football. And Egyptian football was an enormous powerhouse in Africa. And so you got riots, both in Egypt and in Algeria. And in a sense, the Mubaraks were able to sort of polish what was a tarnished reputation
Right.
by supporting the anti-Algerian sentiment at the time.
And what makes it for me, like, do you see any evolution in not only the interaction between politics and sports, but also an evolution in quality of football in the Middle East? I mean, I'm just fast forwarding this really to 2022 World Cup and the amazing performance of course of Morocco. I mean, yeah, we can talk about the basics that a lot of players from abroad, Ziyech was born, a lot of them are Dutch born, among others. I understand, or French born for that matter, in the case of the coach. But our Middle Eastern teams, in particular, North African teams, have they been more professionalized over the years, considering how much political interference is happening in this part of the world as far as sports, big sports are concerned?
I think the perception which you have with Morocco, but
Yeah.
also, for example, with the Saudi defeat of Argentina,
Yeah.
even if the Saudis didn't make it out of the group stage
Yeah.
in the Qatar World Cup, the perception that suddenly these teams are emerging, I think, is wrong.
Right.
You've had football powerhouses in the Middle East for
For a long
several
time.
decades.
Yeah.
The Moroccans, the Algerians,
Brilliant.
the Tunisians,
Right.
and the Egyptians have all done very well
Right.
in Africa, in the African regional tournaments. The Tunisians, the Moroccans, the Saudis, the Egyptians not lately, 2018, have made it to World Cup finals,
Right.
even if they didn't necessarily make it out of the group stage.
Yeah.
The Middle Eastern, as opposed to the North African teams, have done well in Asian competitions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Qatar may not have performed very well in its own World Cup,
But it was the Asian champion.
but it's twice won the Asian Cups.
Right.
Iraq is another powerhouse.
Yeah. Iran, for instance. Yeah.
And Iran, of course. I mean, Iran, Persepolis is one of the most popular and most successful teams in Asia.
Yeah.
The Israelis perhaps would have played better. They were kicked out of the Asian Football Confederation in 1974.
And the Turks are with the Europeans.
And they and the Turks, well, the Turks play in Europe by choice.
Yeah.
Because they always wanted to, by no definition did they want to be part of the Middle East. It had to be Europe. The Israelis had, in a sense, no choice. But what competing in Europe means is that they're up against the world's best.
Yeah.
And so it's a much tougher proposition for them.
Yeah.
So as a matter of principle, sure, what the Moroccans did in Qatar is phenomenal. And they worked very hard at it.
Yeah.
There was tremendous investment in it. But it's not like Morocco is the outlier.
Right. Now, the reason I raise it is because I remember very well in 2018, for instance, Morocco was at the bottom of the group, right? A group with Portugal, Iran, and Spain, no? And it was really a contest among those three groups, no? I mean, Portugal almost got knocked out, no? It was very tight group that I followed very closely. So I never underestimated Morocco, but really there were a breakout star this year and made it all the way to semifinals. Many are talking about the role of course, the coach, a French-born former coach in the French league, and of course more recently in Morocco. And then we also see the Moroccan clubs doing very well in African competition, and both men and women. And this is very important because usually the perception, and I think it's not the perception that is based on just prejudice, is that the female sports are not as well developed in the Middle Eastern and North African region as perhaps they should be, or compared to Northeast Asia, for instance. But we see with Morocco a very balanced and compelling performance by both their female and male team. Is there Moroccan exceptionalism here that we can talk about, and to what degree, if ever?
Okay, two things. One, with regard to women, I think you've got to look at it country by country.
Right.
So North Africa, as a matter of principle, was more advanced, if you wish, in terms of both women's rights and support for women's sports, including women's football. That in Egypt sort of a middle case, but in the Gulf, that's much more recent.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at women's football in Saudi Arabia, that's 5 years old, 6 years old. that prior to the rise of the Salmans, King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, women were banned from it. In the UAE, it's been a struggle. Go back to the 2012 Olympics in London, where Qatar was one of three states, Brunei and Saudi Arabia being the other two, that were basically told, unless you field female candidates,
Right.
you will not participate in the London Olympics. I mean, that was a decade ago.
Right.
Now, I just want to draw a historical analogy in terms of the composition of the Moroccan team. And this also goes to how important football has been in the development in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So in 1954, you had 10 Algerian players playing in France for French clubs, sort of clandestinely leaving France for Tunisia at a moment at which, at a World Cup, and I now forget whether it was Sweden or Switzerland where it was being held, the Algerian resistance and liberation movement declared its war of liberation against the French. These 10 players all went to Tunisia, where they formed the Liberation Front's football team. It was that football team that played 50 games in 53 countries, won all 53 games, that put the Algerian liberation struggle, which was a war that lasted until 1962, 1 million people killed, it put that war on the world map.
Yeah.
So, you know, the fact that you have players with intimate links to the former colonial power as part of your national team is not unique.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Now, going back to this, I mean, thank you for giving us the bigger map, but going back to Morocco, what do you think was obviously it's not a fluke, that's how you say it, but how do you explain, what are the ingredients of success for Morocco? Because the reason I'm doing this is because we're talking about an audience which had no, I mean, in Asia, for instance, right? Many people had no idea about, Morocco being even a force, not even on the African continent. And I think many people thought this is just, maybe because an Arab country like Qatar is hosting it. I don't know, maybe a lot of factors. But for you, what was the winning formula? And do you see this as something?
There was a serious investment.
Right, serious investment. Yeah.
It really is, not only financially.
Yeah.
But also in other ways, in terms of creating a very professional, high quality football culture. And Morocco worked at that.
Start? Can you give us a background? I mean, when did this effort start? When did it reach?
It started. I'm not quite sure what year it started. It started several years ago. I mean, this is not. You don't stamp something like this out of the ground overnight.
Exactly. Yeah.
And they built the academies. They had the grassroots facilities so that good players could come up through the ranks.
Right.
They invested in quality trainers, quality coaches, and of course, and that is an advantage. They had a number of, certainly at the national level, and at the level of the national team, players who were competing in one of the best leagues in the world.
Yeah.
And so these were players who not only had that level of competitiveness, but they also had the experience of playing internationally,
right,
at very senior levels. And I think all of that combined came together.
Yeah.
You can argue whether playing in a culturally more familiar environment played a role. What probably did play a role is that you have a very large Moroccan community resident in Qatar.
Yeah.
So they were not like many other teams, not all other teams, but many other teams, primarily dependent on a fan base that had to travel.
Yeah.
That's not to say that Moroccans did not travel to
Yeah.
Qatar for the World Cup. They did in large numbers. But you look at the game against France, 90% of that stadium was Moroccan.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't French.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that may very well also have played its part.
What about the pan-Arab effect there? Suddenly you have, all these Arab countries showing solidarity. We saw a lot of Qataris, a lot of even Saudis, some others showing. We saw a lot of Palestinians showing a lot of support in the occupied territories. I mean, it's been a while since we saw this kind of explosion of pan-Arab sentiments. I mean, this is so Gamal Abdel Nasser, right? Since 1980s, it's hard to see any serious manifestation of that. And yet here we saw with Morocco that practically Middle East rallied behind it.
I would be cautious to read too much into that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are some important aspects, and let me get to that in a moment. First of all, but let me start off with, as far as I'm concerned, football as a matter of principle is a divider. It's not a unifier.
Us versus them, yeah.
And as I mentioned before, it's an aggressive sport and so on. But more, go back in history. 1914, Germany and England declare a 24-hour ceasefire to play a football game.
Yeah.
And then they spend 4 years killing millions in war.
Yeah.
Look at 2007. Iraq wins the Asian Cup.
In Australia.
In the middle of a sectarian war. Kurds, Shiites, Sunnis on the streets of Baghdad who would hug each other, celebrate together. 24 hours later, they were back at killing each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So unless you really have an environment in which the political powers that be want to build bridges, it's not going to happen. 1968, ping pong, US and China.
Right.
Ping pong couldn't have done it. It was Nixon and Mao
who did it. Yeah.
And used ping pong.
And Kissinger.
That's one aspect of it.
Yeah.
The other part of it is that what I think you saw in Qatar, with the support for the Moroccans and the Moroccan expression, or the Moroccans carrying the Palestinian flag.
Yep.
And that was basically the gap between what public opinion thinks and wants and feels and what the rulers think and want. This was clearly a statement against normalization with Israel.
Mm-hmm. And kind of a bottom.
And it was for Israeli reporters, this was an experience. They expected to be welcomed. They were ostracized. Nobody would talk to them.
Mm. Yep.
I think there was another aspect to this, which has to do with the controversies around the Qatar World Cup. Qataris, but for that matter, others in the Middle East or in the Muslim world for that matter, don't really have a fundamental problem with improvement of workers' rights. Mm-hmm. The issue of LGBTQ is a much more deeply felt, deeply ingrained sentiment. And I think part of what you were seeing was a protest against the way Qatar was being hit over the head. Mm. That's not to say that the criticism wasn't justified.
Right.
But there was one problem with the criticism.
You mean the band, the Rainbow Band, and the Germany, and
all of this stuff.
Yeah.
All of this stuff.
Like cultural imposition. Yeah.
Well, but there was also another problem with it. You had the human rights groups, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the trade unions, all of whom you can discuss tactics, all of this, but as a matter of principle, those were legitimate concerns.
Yeah.
But you had in the debate about Qatar a lot of sour grapes, bias, prejudice, bigotry. And all of that sort of melded into one because the activists who were genuine didn't distance themselves from those who had other motives.
Right.
and in a sense, in that way, to a degree, undermine their own credibility.
So a kind of a clash of culture and values was to a certain degree also at
No,
stake.
no, it's not. That's too simple.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There is a clash of cultural and values, and the discussion there is how do you get from A to B.
Right.
But there is also, so I can't give you the exact quote, but for example, the Guardian at one point published an op-ed piece by one of its sports reporters, who lamented how we being the Europeans,
The West, yeah.
could allow the World Cup to go to a cannibalistic country.
Wow.
This is
That's
a
crazy.
quote.
Mm.
Like Qatar, or allow such cannibalistic countries to buy European sports clubs. I mean, it's clearly a racist.
Racist. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I don't have a problem. The guy has a right to say whatever he wants, and I will defend his freedom of expression and freedom of speech. It's an editorial decision on the part of the Guardian whether or not to publish such a piece. But if you want, as a human rights activist, or as a trade union activist, or as an LGBTQ activist, to be taken serious by those who you're criticizing, you're going to have to distance yourself from this kind of language, this attitude. And this reporter, he was not an exception.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of that. And so what I'm saying is that was a failure of those whose concerns were genuine.
Right. So so for you, there is also this element of post-colonial resentment against what they felt was an imposition of whole sets of values that went beyond fundamental workers' rights and human rights, among others.
No, I don't think I'm not. I don't frame it in terms of colonial, post-colonial.
Mm-hmm.
What I do frame it as,
isn't that how they feel? A lot of people in the Middle East.
That's how a lot of people feel.
Yeah, I'm talking about their feelings. Exactly.
That's how. Look, as a matter of principle, I would defend LGBTQ rights.
Right.
My argument here is not, gee, we have to be culturally sensitive. My argument is very simple. This. Even in those countries like Turkey or Indonesia, where LGBTQ as a matter of principle is not a criminal offense, although implicitly that may be changing in Indonesia with the new criminal law, but even then it's very limited.
Mm-hmm.
But even in those countries, for the LGBT community, it really comes down to a live and let live situation, or don't tell, don't ask, or don't ask, don't tell. So the old Clinton principle in the 1990s when it came to gays in the U.S. military. So what that means is that may be realistically the maximum that you can achieve at this point. And that's where the activists were insensitive. Now, frankly, if it had been the other way around, I don't know that the Middle East, and we were talking about the Middle East pressuring Europe, I don't know that the Middle East would have been any different than Middle East centric.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a leap of mind.
Right.
Basically, and which is why I'm not really willing to put this in colonial and post-colonial terms.
I understand. I mean, I'm just talking about, because I was looking a lot at the Twitter commentaries about this, and I could see, a lot of folks of Asian descent, South Asian, Middle Eastern descent, based in the West, were speaking kind of a post-colonial language and all of that, and I found that interesting. And then there was the aspect of Palestine, of course, and the Israel
But I think that
occupation
in Europe also has a lot more to do with disenfranchisement of communities.
Right.
And again, I think
the Muslim communities, the Moroccans, Tunisians, Algerian descent people.
Foreign communities, non-European communities, whether they're Muslim or not Muslim.
Right.
I mean, obviously, clearly, they're a majority Muslim,
Yeah.
but it's sort of non-European communities, and
Quote.
again, it's part of a greater trend where let's face it, racism has become mainstream.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anti-Semitism is something that can be publicly pronounced,
Mm-hmm.
whereas certainly in the West it was taboo until a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it's part of a broader picture.
Mm-hmm. James, going back to this again, because I want to keep it at football first before I go deeper into the more geopolitical aspect. What is there anything about the Moroccan experience that is, I don't know, could be a best practices that could be adopted by other Middle Eastern countries and by extension here in Asia, for instance, in Southeast Asia? Is the Moroccan experience something that we can learn from, and that is it applicable? Can it be universalized to a certain degree?
Well, to a degree it can. First of all, obviously, with a caveat, Southeast Asia is different from the Middle East.
Of course, yes.
What certainly is the case is, if you are willing to put in the necessary investment,
Right.
create the necessary structures, and support that over a period of time, that's replicable. Anybody can do that as a matter of principle.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other role is take politics out of sports to the degree that you can. Now that goes to a broader discussion
Mm-hmm.
in that, every international sports federation will tell you sports and politics are separate.
Yeah.
It's a total fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Sports and politics are Siamese twins.
Yeah.
They're joined at the hip, and there's no way of separating them.
But it's the quality of the
So if I may,
right. Yeah.
so the solution to that is oversight.
Mm-hmm.
Is creating a code of conduct and enforcing that code of conduct so that you don't get political abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you come to Asia, there was a study several years ago done by an organization called Play the Game, which is a Danish-based organization. It's the world's foremost sports integrity non-governmental organization. And they did a study of political interference
Mm-hmm.
in sports. That the highest grade of political interference in sports was in Asia.
You mean Asia,
including Southeast Asia.
Interesting.
Now that also includes
the Middle East or South America.
The Middle East is at this point. The Middle East is still part of Asian football.
Right. I mean, minus North Africa. Yeah.
Right. So no, North Africa is part of African football.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that will change within a few years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's a different discussion. But at this point, the Middle East, so the Gulf states, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen are all part of Asia.
Right. AFC.
And so obviously they contribute to that higher rate. But it wasn't just, it was other countries too,
China,
Singapore, for example.
Again, I know that neither of us are necessary like everyday fans of what's happening in football, especially here in our part of, or let's call it Southeast Asia for that matter. But what is your understanding of that? I mean, you have written a book or co-written a book on similarities and differences between Middle East and Southeast Asia, right? Geopolitically, economically, socially. But just to talk about football, like you as someone who covered football or followed football quite closely in Europe and in the Middle East, what is your understanding, not as a fan, but as a general observer of the football situation here in Southeast Asia in particular?
Well, I think, first of all, the book really had nothing to do with sports.
Yeah, exactly.
The book was written with my wife, Tess, and we compared political transition in the Middle East and North Africa. So we looked in that book at the Philippines, and she was part of that revolt, and then part of the Corina Aquino government. we looked at Indonesia, of course, and we looked at Myanmar, and then we looked at the other end at the four countries most affected by the 2011 revolt. So Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that was a very different comparison. From what I know about Southeast Asian football, and I'm not not an expert, although I did with
sorry, yeah.
Well, although I did a very long piece comparison of Turkish and Indonesian football that I wrote together with Leonard Sebastian several years ago. One of the most, this is certainly true for Thailand.
Yep.
It's certainly true for Indonesia. Corruption is the greatest problem, and that you saw that with the recent stampede.
Yeah, in the worst, right? Yeah,
in an Indonesian stadium, the worst incident they've had. I would suspect the same is true for smaller Southeast Asian states.
Right.
Laos, Cambodia.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it's true today for Myanmar. It's, to be fair, not true for a country like Singapore.
Right.
The Philippines, you probably know much better than I do, but my understanding is that really football, in comparison to, for example, basketball,
yeah, there's no comparison.
Pales in terms of
pales in terms of.
Yeah. Can you just okay? Hold on a second. Can I just for
Please
1
go
minute?
Ahead, James. No worry.
Tell this person
I know someone is pestering you.
Yeah. No. This. Okay.
Don't worry. I'm just gonna talk while you're doing it.
Yeah. No. Go ahead. I'm done. Yeah. I'm done.
I mean, for me, as far as the Philippines is concerned, I mean, over the past decade, there have been some efforts to make it much more competitive with some degrees of success. Of course, that relied a lot on a lot of overseas Filipinos with mixed background coming back to the Philippines from England, among others. But our female football is doing pretty well. Now we're in the World Cup. Also, of course, similarly, we have relied on Filipinos of mixed background. Of course, there are some people are going to raise eyebrows, but for me, you have to start somewhere, right? And the kind of support I saw for the Filipino women's football, especially last year in the run-up to our qualification to the World Cup, was something that gave me hope that maybe things could turn around. But I don't know, James, if you're aware of this, back in the day, the Philippines had one of the best football teams in Asia. This is because of the Spanish legacy, right? So we had Paulino Alcantara, for instance, who was the top scorer for Barcelona for a very long time. He was an Iloilo Filipino-born. He played for the Filipino national team. We beat China in our first international friendly competition, and then we also beat Japan big time, I think 15-2 or something like that. So 100 years ago, the Philippines would have been like the Japan of Asia, right, in terms of football. And then came the American influence and the obsession with basketball and all. So that's something I want to always go back to, that at one point, if you asked about the Philippines, football would be the natural thing for us, physically, culturally, the Spanish legacy, among others, in ways that basketball would have felt alienating, and yet for accidents of history and culture, basketball will be so dominant. But for me, I don't think history is linear. There's a lot of things that could change, and the fact that the Philippines is not doing as well as it should in basketball as it used to do. I mean, back in the 60s, 70s, it was still making it pretty decent, champion of Asia, among others, but it's really struggling over the past 20, 30 decades. And for me, that shows the limitation of basketball.
Sure,
which is really about height. I mean, let's be honest about it, right? Which is not the case in football as much, right? It's aggressive and all, but a Lionel Messi, could do very well in football in ways that someone with comparatively smaller stature, I doubt, can do as well in basketball. No, so I'm just going. This is the context.
Let me just make one other point. We were talking about what does it take to be successful,
right?
Investment is not the only thing. Look at China.
Exactly. A lot of money.
I mean, here you have a totalitarian leader
Xi Jinping,
who has an obsession with football.
Yep.
I mean, he had 3 wishes. that China qualify for the World Cup, that China hold the World Cup, host the World Cup, and that China win the World Cup.
Right.
He put enormous amounts of money, phenomenal amounts of money into football. He was creating 20,000 academies. China's not performing.
Yep. It's actually going downward, right? They used to qualify back in 2002, if I'm not mistaken, right? China. But now they're I mean, it's getting worse, it looks like, as far as their national team.
Absolutely. So this comes back to my point about the political interference.
Right.
And keeping politics out of it. You know, so you can put whatever money you want into it. It takes more than that.
Yeah. And more than that, they also mean like a certain kind of culture that undergirds it. I mean, because obviously physicality is not an issue. We saw Japan beating Germany and Spain, right? We saw Korea making to semifinals. You know, Latin America is not necessarily the richest country, and we saw the size difference between the Argentina team and the French team, and you can imagine what were the things being said about the French team, right?
Right.
Let's just say the most cosmopolitan team out there, right? So for me, the case of China is really mind-boggling, right? And many Chinese fans themselves were just shocked at how Japan and Korea were doing so well, and China is not even in the conversation. Although part of me is thinking that China may qualify for the next World Cup, because I think the quota will be expanded to 8 from Asia.
48. 48.
Radically changed, because if it's just 4, it's the usual suspects, right? Iran, Japan, South Korea, Australia, right? I mean, it's usually always
Qatar was 32.
Yeah. Right,
which is a fairly significant number in and of itself.
Right.
But the next World Cup, 2026,
48, I think, or something,
which is going to be hosted by the United States, Canada, and Mexico. That's going to be 48 teams.
Yeah, quite interesting. So who knows? Maybe China will make it to the next one. You're absolutely right. Now, where do you see the football in Asia, Southeast Asia going? I mean, particularly in Southeast Asia. I mean, we see Northeast Asia doing very well. We see countries like Morocco, which are not very developed, doing pretty well. And now, do you see Southeast Asia at some point? Like Indonesia, for instance, right? Has a big football culture, right? And a big population. And you wonder if they could be part of the conversation at some point as far as Asian football is concerned. What are your general
they're probably better people. They're probably better people to answer the question than me, frankly. The one remark I will make is, and this is not specifically towards sports as such, or even soccer in particular, but in many ways, Indonesia is like India. It's a lumbering giant. The question is, again, they used to say about Turkey, Turkey's a great country with great opportunity.
Yeah,
it always will have great opportunity. Or be a country of great opportunity.
Or great
potential. With other words, they've got incredible potential, but they're not capable of capitalizing on it. Until not that long ago, Turkey was doing extremely well, and it was capitalizing on it. So I think the question for countries like, particularly India, and I think that comparison is a valid comparison. Countries like that, it's a question of when, not if.
Right.
And on the when, your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah. Thank you for that, James. So let's just transition to the second part, which is going to be much shorter, because I want to do hopefully a much more specialized episode with you down the road. But of course, the other thing that you write a lot about is, how there's an emerging competition among different kind of Muslim majority countries for soft power, and how Islamism is becoming global force as more and more Muslim countries join the ranks of the biggest economies. So in G20, we have at least 3 Muslim majority countries of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Indonesia. Indonesia is expected to be among the 5 largest economies in the coming decades, if not the 3rd or 4th by the middle of the century. Turkey, of course, will always be part of the conversation. Saudi Arabia is there. Countries like Iran, of course, also have tremendous potential to be there down the road, barring certain geopolitical developments. But one of the things we're seeing is that we have multiple Muslim countries with multiple interpretations or versions of Islam, and also essentially propagating that on the international stage. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And obviously, that's also relevant to us here in Southeast Asia. for reasons that we can discuss. But can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, this kind of a soft power competition among Muslim countries. This is interesting because we always had this Huntingtonian simplistic clash of civilization, but we always talk about clash within civilizations, or at least, not necessarily clash, but competition within civilizations. And clearly, Islam is not a monolithic religion, and there are a lot of diversities there. And we're seeing that with more and more Muslim countries becoming influential. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Sorry for the long.
Yeah. No worries. It's actually the theme of my next book.
Right.
But in a nutshell, with post 9/11, so here you had Muslim militants blowing up the World Trade Center, blowing up the Pentagon in Washington.
Right.
The question was why, and suddenly you had this race, which was encouraged by Western countries, but
right.
You had this race to prove that this was not Islam. And you had the call for a moderate Islam, whatever that would mean.
Means, yeah, exactly.
And autocracies, particularly the Middle Eastern autocracies, used that to their advantage. So they became part of the war on terror. They used that as an umbrella for their domestic repression. And they were allowed to do so because this was all moderate Islam. And that, and they also used it to, in my mind, demonize any political expression of Islam. So not just violent political expressions, but also non-violent political expressions. For example, the Muslim Brotherhood. And what you've seen more recently is that you have what I would call an autocratic version of modern Islam, of moderate Islam. So you have the social liberalization that you're seeing in Saudi Arabia or in the United Arab Emirates. And at the same time, you're seeing a tightening of the political screws. Now, none of this involves reform of religious law.
Mm-hmm.
None of that, in fact, involves reform of religion.
Mm-hmm.
It's all social reform. Women's driving is not an issue of religion. It's a social convention, basically. So you have that, and then as opposed to that, you now have an Indonesian movement,
right?
Which, to be clear, Nahdlatul Ulama, which is a conservative movement.
Yep.
It's not a liberal movement by any stretch of the imagination, but which argues that unless you start reforming Islamic law and taking out problematic clauses, for example, the concept of a kafir or an infidel, the concept of a dhimmi, which is people of the book, Jews, Christians, and more recently expanded to Buddhists and Hindus, who are protected by an Islamic regime, state, whatever, but do not have equal rights. Or in Islamic law, the concept of slavery still exists, for example. And then you get into the issues of blasphemy, apostasy, that unless you reform those, and unless you recognize that the argument that all of these militants are deviants, they're not Muslims, and accept that they are Muslims, and that they are basing their actions, their ideology, whether it's Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, whatever, on existing Muslim texts that need to be, not the Quran, because the Quran's untouchable because it's the word of God, but those other texts are not the word of God and can be reformed. Then unless you do that, and unless you recognize that Muslims have a problematic past when it comes to the other, as much as colonial powers, Christians, Jews, whoever else do. Unless you do that, there will always be a problem.
James, where do you
So that's that rivalry
Yeah.
that's going on, and it's a rivalry that's as much about theology
Mhm.
as it is about geopolitics.
Mhm. Is there like a kind of a Nusantara Islam that we're talking about as far as Indonesia is concerned? I mean, is that something that you subscribe to, or this idea that in Southeast Asia the version is much more cosmopolitan because of the circumstances of the conversion and the history of this region?
I think. Look, let me. I mean, that Nusantara Islam is the term that that Nahdlatul Ulama uses in Bahasa.
Right, right.
I mean, in English they call it humanitarian Islam. In my mind, Nahdlatul Ulama is unique in a lot of ways, and also unique in Southeast Asia. First of all, it is the world's largest Muslim civil society movement.
Mm-hmm.
There is no movement of that size. I mean, you have Muhammadiyah
Right.
and if they're half the size, they're large. They have, Indonesia is a country of 270 million people. 1/3, 90 million, are followers of Nahdlatul Ulama.
Right, that's a lot. Yeah.
That's one. Two, they have a religious authority of their own.
Right.
So they don't need, and most Southeast Asian Muslims do, they don't need the authority of Al-Azhar, the oldest
Egypt,
seat of Islamic learning in Cairo, or Mecca or Medina. They have their own authority. The third thing is, and that's a double-edged sword in my mind, they have a 5 million strong militia, paramilitary militia. I mean, these guys can field people on the street. There's real street power there. So that's what makes a movement like that. You've had calls in the past for jurisprudential reform, but those were always either individuals,
or
with more or less a stature, or Prince Hassan of Jordan, for example, or intellectuals. It never was a mass movement with this sort of clout and credibility, and that's a real challenge for people like Mohammed bin Salman or the UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed, who really want to totally control the religion to justify and serve their and ensure the survival of their regimes.
And James, I appreciate you pointing this out, because usually the idea is that the center of influence, the authentic, interpretation of the text, and it's usually kind of from Middle East to the peripheries, right? Especially to Southeast Asia. But what we're saying right now is that in Nusantara Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, there is this sense of authenticity, of authority on their own, and that on their own they can project a global, universal kind of interpretation of Islam. Is that also a reflection of the fact that Indonesia has also kind of arrived on the world stage? I mean, and not to overread into this, but clearly Indonesia is finally getting a little bit of limelight, right? In ways that it was never getting proportionate to its size, right?
Okay, there's several issues here. First of all,
right.
Saudi Arabia has one serious advantage. It's home to the holy cities.
Right, cradles.
Millions of Muslims will never be going to Indonesia on a pilgrimage. They will always be going to Saudi Arabia on a pilgrimage. And so there are obstacles to a group like Nahdlatul Ulama popularizing this. And of course, there's the built-in bias that certainly the Middle East has, as we're the original Muslims. we speak the language of the Holy Book, and so on. It's going to be a process. It's certainly part of where Indonesia would like to be going. Clearly, I mean, the G20, the group of 20, which brings together the world's largest economies, which was last year chaired by Indonesia and had its summit in Bali in November. Indonesia handled that extremely well and came out of it fundamentally smelling like roses.
Right, very much. Yeah.
But when it comes to the religious aspect, in my mind, the Saudis, the Emiratis are increasingly viewing Nahdlatul Ulama as a threat. But it's a threat that they have to deal with. And so it's a question of trying to either neutralize or co-opt. They failed so far with regard to Nahdlatul Ulama. They've been somewhat successful with Joko Widodo, the Indonesian president, because money talks. And a lot of money has gone into Indonesia. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
Thank you very much, James, that just made me realize we have to have really much more in-depth discussion, especially in the background of this, when this competition start. You had also a piece about how India is navigating this as they take over G20. And of course, Indonesia is a big member, but Saudi Arabia is also there. The Emiratis have been kind of a observer status and increasingly kind of a honorary member. So we're going to have more in discussion of this, especially later this year as more documents and all come out on this. So thank you very much, James, for your honesty, for your courageous expression of views. I know we covered a lot. We went all the way from what Algerian footballers were doing during the liberation fight against France, all the way to what's happening with Indonesia, Emiratis, among others. I really appreciate it, James. I hope you get some good rest. I know you were on travel and all. And hopefully this is just the beginning of more conversations and back and forth. Is there something?
I hope so. I enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Hopefully next time we can do it over tea or coffee and much more in person.
You have a deal.
Thank you very much. Shukran.
Take care.
Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.
The recording has stopped.
Thank you very much, James. I really appreciate it. I just realized when you explained this, like, oh my God, I have to do a lot of background explanation because we have a very diverse audience who may not follow up with this. But what
no, sure, I understand.